Kafka's finally out, the most anticipated unit in the game, and she's certainly the most interesting unit so far. But does that mean she's good? Well, first, subscribe. A whopping 99.9% of you out there are subbed to me, and it says that just one person isn't. Someone named John. You better sub to me, John. So, Kafka. I want to say this straight from the jump. Kafka is the most future-proof character we've received yet, besides maybe Silverwolf. It's hard for me to think of a similar character in Genshin or most gacha games that I've played, to be honest. So why is this? Well, a lot of reasons. So stick around so I can explain those, but also more on break effect as well as dots in general. Kafka's skill deals damage but also procs all dots currently on an enemy, and her ultimate does the exact same thing when you acquire a bonus ability on a trace. To refresh your memory of my banger video, how to do massive damage with Kafka, dots are a specific debuff that procs on an enemy's turn. The ones we currently have are Shock, Wind Shear, Burn, and Bleed. In my break effect video, I mentioned Quantum's Entanglement, and while that does do damage on an enemy turn, it's technically not considered a dot debuff. So fuck me, am I right? All of these dots can be procced in two ways. Breaking an enemy with that element, in which every character of that element in the entire game will then add a dot, or with a character's specific kit. Take for instance Sampo, who procs Wind Shear with, well, everything, versus someone like Asta, who only procs Burn with her normal attack after she gets a talent. So Kafka being able to proc dots makes any character who does them naturally instantly better. Like, infinitely so. Take Sampo for instance. His entire kit centers around dots, and he does fine damage with them, but being able to proc his dots 2 or more times before the enemy even moves means that you've effectively almost tripled his damage. And this ends up being true for everyone who can add dots in the game. And by everyone, I mean mostly everyone. Technically, all lightning, fire, physical, and wind characters can add dots with a break. Of course, it isn't an assurance or anything, but keep that in mind for now. We'll get into how break effect dots are different from normal dots in a bit, but just keep in mind that Kafka procs every kind of dot, regardless of whether they were added through a break or not. Kafka's proc that she does with her skill and ultimate don't actually diminish the time on a dot as well, meaning that if your dot says it lasts 3 turns, meaning every 3 enemy turns, it will still last those 3 enemy turns, even if you proc it 78 million times with Kafka's skill and ultimate. This means she fundamentally changes the nature of dots and dot-centered characters. She becomes the dot. Don't let the dot-centered kit fool you though. Kafka is no slouch with damage. She has high damage multipliers for her skill and ultimate. Kafka can definitely be a main DPS and sub DPS. I think a common misconception people are going to have with her is that she's only used in dot teams, which isn't true. Now, I do think it's true that if you want to run a dot team, you will need Kafka, but her kit is self-sustaining, and because she scales on attack and procs all dots, even if they're only from a break, you could run a plethora of characters with her, especially free-to-play ones. Just know though that if you like Kafka, she's not completely dot reliant. Just so happens that dot teams though will absolutely be an incredible comp for her and her best at the present time. Speaking of damage, Kafka also has a talent that when any ally normal attacks an opponent, she does a follow-up attack that has a 100% base chance to add shock and does decent attack-based multipliers as well. Her ultimate also has a 100% base chance to add shock to an enemy. Now, if you saw that 100% base chance and thought that it meant that there was a guarantee that her follow-up or ultimate would add shock to the enemy, then I wouldn't blame you. You'd be dumb as fuck, but I wouldn't blame you. Last video, we spoke of damage percent versus scaling stats, but let's have a quick crash course on effect hit rate real quick, because not only is it really important for Kafka, but also all characters who add debuffs to enemies. And by the way, dots are considered debuffs. Just want to let that there. The formula is actually simple this time, and it's the following. First, you find the base chance to add a debuff. Let's use Kafka's, for example. It's 100%. Easy. Then this effect hit rate would be what your character has on their stat screen, which includes adding together relic stats for effect hit, Lightcone buffs, and talents that increase effect hit. Then this effect resistance is the enemy stats. Now, in 1.0, the highest possible effect resistance from enemies was a whopping 50%, but but likely because they wanted to make characters like Silverwolf and Kafka better, this got dropped to 40%. So if we want to see how our characters will apply debuffs in the hardest content, we drop a 40% here. Then, finally, there's debuff resistances. Some enemies in the game straight up have resistances to things like burn and freeze, and you can often tell if this is the case, if they're on fire or frozen. So with this calculation, I think it's fair to remove the resistance aspect since not many enemies in the game have this. Bye! 99% of enemies won't have resistances to debuffs, so let's instead do the formula as if they just don't have it at all. I'll include a link in the description though for enemies that do have resistances in case you wanted to check that out. So in this formula, how much effect hit does Kafka naturally get? Well, she has 18% that she gets from her talents, but she also gets a whopping 30% increase to her base chance to apply shock from her bonus ability after reaching her final ascension. So with just these added stats, Kafka will have a 92% chance of landing shock on the most effect resistant enemies in the game. If you gave her just 10% more effect hit rate from Relic substats, this pushes her to effectively 100% chance to land her shocks. So shocking with Kafka ends up being super easy once you've essentially finished enhancing her whole board. That 30% increase to the base chance is a huge buff to her, so do not forget to acquire this. So back to her shock. Kafka's shock scales based on her attack stat, and it scales really insanely. For reference, Serval also can shock enemies, and her shocks also are based on her attack stat. For her scaling at talent level 6, her shocks deal 62% of her attack to an enemy. Kafka, also at talent level 6, deals 175% of her attack, essentially 3 times as much damage. It's actually very crazy. So obviously attack will be nutty on her, so let's quickly discuss how you want to build her. There currently is not a DoT dedicated set in the game, and I think that this will be the first way that the game will truly buff Kafka. And if I'm being honest, I think this one is eventually inevitable. With how many characters work off of dots, which we will get into, and how much some like Sampo and Kafka rely on them, I think we will have to eventually get a set. But until then, sets that boost Kafka's DoT scaling stat attack will have to do. And the 2 sets that currently do that are the Musketeer set and Sizzling Thunder. You could run a combo of these for better substats, or a combo of either of those with Messenger for more speed, or either of those sets for piece effects. I personally think Sizzling Thunder is currently the best bet due to the fact that you'll always want to be using Kafka's skill, meaning you'll have the 20% always up, as well as the 10% damage percent increase, which works on her whole kit as well. As for the stats, I can see some people asking why we wouldn't build crit on her here instead of the attack percent, but that's because dots cannot crit. Her dots are insane, and so those should be the focus when building her. So no crits means you shouldn't be bothering with trying to get crits on her skills or ultimates. It's not a wasted stat technically because the attacks themselves can crit, but since the dots cannot, do not waste the chest piece on a crit stat. Now, dots can't crit, but due to the wording, they are affected by elemental damage bonus. And like I said in my last video, if you're building for damage, you should almost always use an elemental sphere. Now, the speed is something we need to discuss as well. The speed stat is a tricky one and one that takes a little bit more explaining. In an earlier video, we spoke about action value, which you can turn on in your settings. The lower your action value, the quicker your character will act. In short, speed affects this action value, and so it can cause you to go more turns quicker when your speed hits certain breakpoints. The one I want to focus on is 134 speed. This number means that, using Memory of Chaos as an example, every 3 cycles, your character will act twice in that cycle. You can see why this would matter for Kafka. This means that, say, in the 3rd cycle, Kafka will be able to proc a DoT 3 times, 2 skills and an ultimate, before the enemy even does their turn to proc the DoT naturally. This is insane damage, and because of this, I think that this is the initial speed breakpoint that people should focus on with her. Because speed is such an annoying stat to get on Relics as a substat, I think this is why you should go for it on her main stat for her boots. As for Lightcones, I actually don't hate Nihility Lightcones as much as I do Destruction. They're all actually fun to play around with, and some even add little extra debuffs to a character's kit when they're used. Like her signature Lightcone, which is obviously her best. If you are using it though, or other Lightcones that add extra debuffs, be wary that you will need more effect hit rate to guarantee those always hitting. It'll be the same calculus though. As for her Lightcones, I suggest Fermata. It's definitely the best free-to-play option, as you can get it as a drop on the weekly bosses, as well as just buying it straight out from the Memory of Chaos store. As for my favorite 4-star option though, it's Good Night and Sleep Well. It has incredible damage increases, since the target should always have multiple debuffs on her team. So let's talk about those. Kafka can be run optimally with any of the DoT-based characters, of which there are quite a few. But before we name them, we need to point out how any addition of new DoT characters in the future, who are good at all, will be a buff to Kafka. She's so essential for these teams that this has to be mentioned. So the characters in the game that can deal dots with their kits are Silverwolf, Luka, Sampo, Hook, and Asta and Himeko with bonus abilities. My favorite unit for Kafka is obviously Sampo though. Sampo increases dot damage with his ultimate by a whopping 30% for 2 turns. This also applies to break dots as well. He also applies wind shear with every aspect of his kit, and his multi-hit skill has high break efficiency, which is great for having someone on your team having a break effect build, which we'll get into. A similar character to Sampo for break efficiency is Asta. She can burn with her normal attacks after receiving the talent, and she also increases the team's attack and speed, both great for Kafka DoT teams since their dots are based on attack, and Kafka wants as much speed as possible, as we spoke about. Having Asta do her normal attacks isn't a waste as well, as she'll burn, and it will allow Kafka to do her follow-up attack. Another fun unit is Silverwolf, as she increases Kafka's shock uptime with her kit, and her and Kafka's dots can be up at the exact same time. That's another important thing to know. As long as different characters are adding a dot, they will be different debuffs. So take a team like Kafka, Silverwolf, Hook, and Asta. Let's say Asta breaks the enemy, and the rest have added their dots through their kits naturally. This would mean the enemy would have 2 shocks on them and 3 burns. So then Kafka would then proc all 5 of those with her skills and ultimates. Obviously, you wouldn't want to run this team, but it does illustrate that you can currently potentially have 5 dots on an enemy at once, which is pretty nutty. Another good teammate is obviously Bronya. With the correct speed tuning, Bronya can just push Kafka up to proc all dots again. Bronya is broken. The only thing a Kafka team is really missing out on, in my opinion, is a sustainer character that has dots built into their kit. Yes, healers like Natasha and Bailu can break an enemy, technically, to add a dot, but that's definitely not consistent, and their break efficiency is dookie garba. The one way to currently work around this, though, is with the Lightcone trend of the universal market. This can be put on preservation characters, and allows for them to add a burn to a dot when the enemy hits them, with S5 giving a 120% base chance. This dot also scales on defense. I actually think it's a perfect choice for Kafka teams as a sustainer's option currently, without a sustainer that currently has dots in their kit. Characters like Fire MC and Japard would work great with this Lightcone, so as long as you pulled it, I think that those are the top choices for a Kafka team sustainer. Another option in team building is building one character on the team with break effect. As I said in the previous video, Kafka is great with this as she procs it too with her skill and ultimate. But something I didn't mention about break effect is that it is heavily reliant on a character's level. If you ever want to run a character as a break effect character, they essentially need to be level 80. It's also important to note that you'll never want to build more than one character with a break effect build on the same team, because to make use of that build, that specific character needs to be the one that's breaking the enemy. So I personally think that only characters with high break efficiency, like Sampo or Asta, should be run under this build. You can essentially assure that they'll be the ones to break, and they'll break often since their skills are multi-hit. Another thing to keep in mind with break effect is that elemental damage bonus doesn't apply to break dots. So let's say you build Asta as a break effect build, you would not want to give her a fire sphere, but rather you'd want to run her with a break effect relic. This is one of the few instances where an elemental sphere isn't wanted if you're focusing on the damage here. A teammate then who would be great in these types of teams with someone who has break effect is Pela, since dots under break effect and normal dots do more damage to enemies with lower defense. Locha is also just a great teammate for Kafka in general, since he's so incredibly skill point efficient and does mostly normal attacks, so Kafka will always do her follow-ups before her next turn. Now, what did I mean at the beginning when I said she was future-proof? Well, as I've always said, to be a future-proof character, you need to do one of two things: break a mechanic or do extreme off-turn utility, and Kafka absolutely does the first. Dots were absolutely a bottom-tier damage team prior to Kafka, because you had to wait for an enemy's turn, but Kafka breaks that idea and allows for them to proc multiple times before their turn. So then, because of this, Kafka's ceiling is incredibly high. Here are the ways that she could be boosted in the future: a set that increases dot damage, a character or set that increases break efficiency. If this happened, then so many more characters could be run on the break effect build with Kafka. Anybody who raises break damage, any new characters that just have high break efficiency naturally, and obviously any new powerful dot characters. Her ceiling is so high because of all of this, and that's why I think she's currently the most future-proof DPS character. Breaking an aspect of combat and then having so many ways to make that character even better in the future is crazy. They clearly want her to be a staple in teams for a long time coming. So that's Kafka. Boy, is there a lot to her, and I already think that there's things I probably left out here. So if I have, let me know in the comments, and let me know what you think about her in general. She's a complex character, but I personally think she's the most fun character to play in the game. I also want to say thank you to my patrons. You all are amazing, and I really appreciate your support. But regardless of if you got or are getting Kafka, I'll see you all next time.